A reading of the book Two Beans Henceforth, A Song of Blood and Beans, written by Buff Nips. Chapter 1, A New Bean Beginning. In this book you will learn about beans, bean cream, famous bean monuments, bean genocide, black beans, kidney beans, bean helicopter with a bean on top that spins, bean religion with bean Jesus who died for our beans, non-edible beans, individually wrapped beans, bean jeans with extra pockets for more beans, a bean that sleeps with your wife, bean eugenics, bean colada. Do you like bean colada? Getting caught in the beans. Oh, Taylor Swift, but all her songs are about beans. Now we got baked beans, mutant bean age ninja beans, invisible beans, Adam and Bean, not Adam and Eve, and other beans that you've never even heard of. Beans, like all food items, came from the ground, but they were planted there by a person. There is no recorded history of a bean ever planting itself in the soil, and if you were the first person to film that in the wild, you would be flooded with bean riches. If you compared the first ever bean to the modern bean, they wouldn't even speak the same language. That's because cavemen picked only the biggest beans to plant. Fast forward that a million years, and it's apples to oranges, or beans to beans, though they don't appear as such. The first bean was a flimsy-whimsy toenail of a thing, but the modern bean is a rotund pellet of protein. When we talk about the history of beans, you're asking many questions at once because truly no one remembers where the first bean originated. They say it was a flimsy thing, yes, a bean of small size and stature, yet it mystified the royals, and it was passed among their line generation to generation, a small little token to be appreciated by the children and elders alike. There was a lot of inbreeding among the British royals at this time, and it's speculated that they saw themselves in that stunted, deformed little bean. The known whereabouts of the first bean ended in 1873, when England burned in a fire. But from fire comes new growth. Many plants don't even sprout until they get first burned down, and they actually require the fire to make berries and food and such. So maybe this was the case with the first bean, because after the fire of England in 1873, the entire continent of England was soon covered in bean plants, sprouting through the ashes. So it's speculated that this one flimsy bean, guarded and protected solely for its singular flimsiness and worthlessness, ended up giving birth to about 1,100% of the bean plants in all of England. This is widely accepted because soon everyone in England, once they rebuilt their homes of course, soon every single kid on the street had their own little bean because they were popping out of the ground everywhere. Why did the British people connect with the bean so much? This was around the time that England was losing its empire, so they were trying to replace an empire built of countries with an empire built of beans. How did this new empire compare to the old one? Basically, it was no replacement at all, but it was something for the British people to focus on now that they had so much free time without all of those colonies to look after. When you think about British people as a whole, what comes to mind? I think of their self-deprecating humor based on a deep, deep loneliness, the funny words they use for things like telly or saying mum instead of mom. They're desperate for something to latch onto and identify with still to this day. So you can understand that back then, all it took was a little bean to send the whole country into a happy uproar. And now they had thousands of beans. So many beans they didn't know what to do with them. This was an era of bean surplus. Like I said, beans were so common that every Steve, Michael, and Janice in the neighborhood carried around their own pouch of beans. Naturally, the competitive nature of children led to bean games, bean competitions, bean-offs, and so you would trade for the larger bean. You would play the games. You would go to the contests. You would go to the festivals. Collect every single bean you can trade with the kids who have the beans you don't, and get the ones they have. And even the adults joined in, and the whole bean system worked great until America was formed. Now this gets into territory of bias, because I am an internationally traveled person, yet my passport reads that I am a resident of the United States of America. Yet my bias in this particular bean issue sides neither with the English or the Americans, but with the French. Let me explain why. Chapter 2. The Empire Strikes Bean. So we have England, the greatest bean empire in the world. We have America, a small little country of plucky pilgrims and rascally Indians. We all hear about that tea getting tossed into the river in America for that tax write-off purposes, but no one talks about the beans. 1,000 tons of beans tossed into the Thames River in response to the Americans' tea vandalism, which resulted in over 1,000 fish drinking cold tea. Yuck. See, the Americans threw tea in a mocking manner and pouted their faces as if they were English people crying over their beloved tea. The British thought they were being clever with their retaliation of throwing beans in the river because the joke was that Americans are so fat and smelly because they eat so much beans. The subtleties of British humor are truly lost on Americans who thought the beans were a gift of surrender, happily planting the beans that floated across the pond to America. This is where everything changed. Let's go over the timeline quickly. We start with a lonely, flimsy bean who sleeps its way to the top of the British monarchy. We lose track of it for a few years, and suddenly beans are the national symbol of England, with bean plants growing from every crevice of brick and stone on every pub and telly. Now all of a sudden, beans are growing in America, but Americans weren't satisfied with the bean's shape or color and bred their beans under harsher and stricter rules to create the perfect bean. But their bean was no bean at all. Now this goes into the realms of genetic modification and evolution in biology, and the point of this audiobook is mainly focusing on the cultural and societal impact that the bean has had on Earth. But plants can change dramatically over years, like we saw with the British turning their flimsy little bean speck into a voluptuous, protein-packed bean. But Americans, as we all know, have no self-control, and they turned the bean into a mutated monstrosity, with one bean growing into not just one singular bean, but a large elongated stalk or stick or cob, from which many more beans then sprouts. Yes, corn cobs mutated from the beans that migrated over to America from England. The section of the book may draw criticism and controversy for the fact that there's lots of documented evidence about the history of corn or maize in South America and Central America. However, the bean sources for this book go very deep and very far back, and I have to reveal now that they go beyond the commonly known bean literature. I have access to a collection of some of the oldest unreleased bean scrolls. Now, to go any further, we have to go back, but this time it's personal. Chapter 3. The Frenchman. Enter Benoit Jeffany, a Frenchman circus accountant who grew up traveling the stony shores of England with his circus band during the American-British bean conflicts. Jeffany was saddened by the back-and-forth warring, a poet who grew up in post-fire England and surviving by the beaten skin of his circus feet. Frolicking among the young beanstalks was young Benoit's only true passion. Benoit was disturbed to see the beans of his childhood being tossed into the river. He wrote scroll upon scroll and poems detailing his studies into the bean and its power over man. He's the guy who made up the Beans Magical Fruit song. Yeah, it was in his later years. He kind of sold out later on, but in his youth he was a fiery and powerful activist, and a scientist who pushed forward all that we know about beans. Much of his life is shrouded in mystery beyond what he reveals in his private bean scrolls and bean studies. Yet it is known that at some point he fell in love with Beanie Bernstein. Her name was a coincidence, but their love was not. In fact, it is believed that Beanie had little interest in bean politics, and that she was the one who finally dragged Benoit away from the activist and scientist life to raise a bean family. How do we know this when Google search brings nothing for the name Benoit Jeffany? Well, because I am Bugman Jeffany, great-great-grandson of Benoit and Beanie Jeffany. Yes, I inherited all of the secret bean scrolls and knowledge that up to this point was hidden and lost to the sands of time. Or should I say, the beans of time. But anyway, keep Benoit in mind because he ties back into the bean themes in this next part. Chapter 4. Back to the beans. To go back, first we have to go a bit forward. What's going on with beans here in the shiny 2000s? Well, let me sing it out for you. Back Beans Back, all right. Hit single from the Backbean Boys exploded popularity of beans for younger generations and spawned a million varieties and flavor of bean. Bean wallets, chocolate beans, vanilla beans, beans with a screwdriver attachment, beans for birthdays, bean lunchbox, green beans, string beans, purple beans, brown beans, big beans, small beans, golden beans, rainbow beans, robot beans, ingrown beans, mega beans, micro beans, bean rights, bean legislation, bean laws, bean people, bean conspiracy, bean trading cards, bean microwave, microwaved beans, beans on toast, eaten by a ghost, person who choked on beans, died and turned into a bean ghost, bean audiobook, bean jacket, been there done that, bean telescope filled with beans, and regular beans. But that kind of explosive popularity has to crash. Just ask Pokemon. Nowadays, the beans have run dry, the bean river has been flattened, and the bean executives are desperately scrambling for a new way to appeal to the youth. Hey, I'm not a marketing person. Heck, I have no formal education. But bean TikTok. Did you try bean TikTok? Put the bean in a little skirt and make it dance around. Hey, I'm getting excited already. It's really not that hard. I would do it myself, but I have integrity. And my body is too long to fit in the frame to dance. It's the same annoying thing like when I'm taking a shower at my uncle's house, just crouching all hunched over, like Gandalf blew out his ass at Bag End and he needed to take a shower. See, that's a bit of blue humor for the three-way Venn diagram cross of bean fans, fantasy nerds, and immature children. But the point is that the popularity of the beans had waned. But even if beans had temporarily dipped, we know they'll always be back. Beans were a part of the hottest pop music, and now billionaire executives are losing their minds over the beanstalk. But how did it get here? Remember a little French guy called Benoit Jeffany? My great-great-grandpa who left me all the hidden bean knowledge he discovered? Let's go back to him. Benoit was already disturbed by the British people's disregard for the beans' welfare, but now he was downright disgusted, seeing the way the selfish Americans handled the beans that floated across the pond. He knew it was wrong, but he didn't see any way of stopping it. So he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to dream and write his bean poetry and think of a better day filled with beans. Back over with the British, they were devising a way to regain control over their intellectual property, the bean. In American schools, the children are taught that America was formed when all the smart people with brains decided to leave a bean-obsessed monarchy. Clearly, this was more heavy-handed American propaganda that just made the whole country woefully unprepared when the first strike hit. In the middle of prime Beanland America, a British missile struck, designed by the remaining smart British people, an enemy the Americans were convinced was impossible. But missiles came, and soon came the robots. Bean-retrieving robots that scooped whole bean plants out of the soil to return them to England. Not to mention the countless American lives that were lost when the primitive British robots mistook humans for bean plants and scooped their heads out of their necks. This was seen as an act of war to the Americans. The Americans retaliated in a series of skirmishes and battles that ravaged bean farmland on both sides of the war. They taxed our tea, so we taxed their beans, back and forth forever. Looking back today, it is hard to comprehend the amount of horror that was caused by a single bean. Young children drafted into war to fight a battle for bean causes they didn't understand. This is the time when guns were still primitive, but beans were plentiful. Children shot beans from slingshots and straws, but it was no match for the British robots. Headless children everywhere who were mistaken for bean plants. This started a whole new culture of headless people who only wanted to find a way to live. But of course the country only cares about the war, not helping those who come home from it. But that is a book for another day. It was soon clear to both sides that the bloodshed could not go on. The British sought to create a weapon so powerful that it would end the war forever, inspired by the atomic bomb that ended World War II almost 100 years later. So the British upgraded their bean retrieving robots into a humanoid form called Michael the British Robot. Michael looked like a human except for his head, which was a clear dome filled with beans, so his enemies would know what his purpose was. Why would the British want people to know what Michael was up to before he started attacking people for their beans? Well, Michael was so powerful that it didn't matter. The whole idea was that he would intimidate the Americans into backing down, without need for leveling entire cities with a bomb like the Americans did. Clearly, there was still some smart people in England. Beanois, still traveling with his circus folk as a side job, wrote poem after poem about how Michael the British Robot was a bad idea for humans and beans. It turns out Beanois actually was a fan of the atomic bomb and thought it was probably a better way to end things for good. Yes, Beanois up to this point seems like a peaceful man who does not want more bloodshed, but he was also a practical man, and he saw all of the orphaned, headless children who were the result of the last British plan to end the war. Beanois grew a small following of anti-Michaelists, but the pro-Michaelists were much louder. You see, the design of Michael was very handsome. Apart from his glass dome head filled with beans, Michael was the picture of the perfect, most handsome British man. It is speculated that the character of James Bond was written after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was inspired by the suave beauty and capable hands of Michael the British Robot. So now it might be helpful to have an idea of what Beanois looked like. He certainly wasn't an ugly man by any means, but Michael the British Robot, with his suave and sophisticated personality, cut a hard contrast against Beanois' bumbling and pudgy frame. It should be no surprise that the public far more often than not supported Michael's bean actions instead of listening to ugly old Beanois. Even though Beanois did not have public support, he did have enough of the following to arrange a debate with Michael the British Robot. This turned out to seem like the worst idea ever, with Beanois sweating and stumbling and stuttering on stage, while Michael the British Robot told jokes, made the crowd laugh, and presented his bean ideas in a sophisticated way. At this point, you might think it was all over for Beanois, with everyone seeing how much cooler Michael was. However, the British people, it seems, were not as fooled by the flashy exterior as the Americans might have been. After the debate was televised, there grew among the British people doubts about Michael's true intentions, or the intention of those created him. Of course, Michael was a robot, and his head was filled with beans, not brains. This was one of Beanois' talking points that he stuttered and stumbled through expressing, but apparently it struck a chord with the British people, who became suspicious of what was going on in that bean-filled dome. Over the next few years, Michael's support dwindled, and Beanois became an unlikely voice of the people. Soon the people started wanting Beanois to be sent over to fight the Americans. This puzzled Beanois because he was an artist, a poet, not a fighter, and nothing he ever spoke about gave the impression that he wanted to fight people. But as often happens when a person enters the public sphere, their identity, at least to the world, becomes separate from who they really are. Beanois feared that his power had become too great to accurately spread the message in his heart. Beanois retreated from public life and continued to write poem after poem about beans. During this time, Michael the British Robot was going through a crisis. After his job was temporarily given back to the bean plant retrievers, Michael's entire life was about being praised and loved for how inherently great and beautiful and capable he was when it came to beans. So when that was taken away from Michael, he had nothing left. Beanois had to work for every ounce of affection that he had gained ever since he was a boy, born into this cruel world. So for Beanois, this time of uncertain limbo was as familiar as a warm bed, or a warm bed of soil. He did what he always did with his uncertainty and fear, and he turned it into poems, bean poems, poems about beans, new studies about how beans grow. He dived deep into the bean sciences, and as Michael coped with a lack of purpose, Beanois flourished in the bean palace of his mind. With scientific bean grants and success as a poet, it was finally time for Beanois to leave his life with the circus. This was the hardest decision in Beanois' life, because the circus was a family that picked him up after he was orphaned in England when the fire burned everything down. Beanwa didn't have any circus freak powers or cool extra appendages. He was accepted in simply because he was a baby with nowhere to go. Also back then they used babies to hold down the ropes that hold up the circus tent because those spikes weren't invented yet. As Beanwa grew older, he tried different circus acts to find his place. He had small successes with the clowns, but he wasn't funny enough. He worked as an assistant for the freak performances, but he wasn't freaky enough. He interned with the bearded woman, but accidentally shaved her beard off. Beanwa had to accept early on that maybe there wasn't anything in the world that he was good at. He wondered why, then, that the circus people didn't throw him out. He was always waiting for the day to come when the freak master broke the news that they couldn't afford to keep him on and pay him his required amount of beans. But it never came, and as time went on, Beanwa was part of the family, and soon his small memories of being an orphan baby were buried by the colorful, vibrant circus life and warm embrace of his circus family. He settled in as the circus financial records keeper, and he was bad with numbers, but he was able to do a passable job. Beanwa had lots of free time during shows and on the road where he would explore the young regrowth across the scorched English land. This is when Bean spoke to Beanwa, and Beanwa was ready to listen. Young bean plants as far as the eye could see, growing from the rubble of civilization. Beanwa began to write about the beans. He was given a pencil and paper for his work as the financial records keeper, but soon he had to make excuses for why he needed more paper to write more numbers. In reality, he was writing about the beans. Beanwa had no conception of poetry or writing, but his love for the beans flowed through him. One day the freak master stumbled upon Beanwa sitting in the bean fields after Beanwa said he was going to go work on some numbers and financial records. The freak master saw what Beanwa was writing contained very little numbers, and although the freak master could not read it, it was clear that Beanwa was not writing about financial records. Beanwa was scared that he would be kicked out and sued for doing his job improperly and stealing job materials. To his surprise, the freak master was moved by his bean poems. The freak master encouraged Beanwa's writing and often asked to see what he was working on. He became a mentor-like figure to Beanwa and even offered Beanwa a spot in the circus show near the end where he can recite his bean-based poetry. Beanwa never thought what he was doing was anything more than satisfying a natural urge to let out what is within. It was an urge with no end goal, and Beanwa often disposed of his poem immediately after writing them. Oftentimes, he would sit among the bean fields for hours, writing about the beans, bugs, and soil, and when the circus was ready to hit the road, he would fold the poem up and bury it under a small bean plant. It was half symbolic and half scientific, for even at this young stage in Beanwa's life, he began to observe and learn things about the biological side of the bean. For instance, he noticed that beans growing closer to the stony shores and the water grew stronger with a larger bean yield, and the plants further from the shore made a smaller bean. So it was Beanwa's perceived lack of purpose and his acceptance of that which led him to the beans. With the way Beanwa disposed of his writing, it was a shock then that the freak master wanted Beanwa to recite his poetry during the show. The poetry segment only lasted a few shows before being cut, not because people didn't like it, and it's true they didn't like it, but it was cut because Beanwa didn't care to share his bean work. In fact, he thought it might taint his passion. So he continued to write and write until he became the cultural leader and bean activist we know him as today. The day that Beanwa knew it was finally time to leave the circus to become an activist full-time was said to be the saddest day of his life. No longer were the beans an escape and a pleasure that enhanced his life. Now they were the entire focus, and no longer were his writings seen only by the roots and bacteria of the soil, but they were read and dissected by millions of British people and the few Americans who read the bean flyers stuffed inside bottles that floated across the pond. Remember, there was no internet at this time, so a lot of what was going on each side of the war was completely unknown to the others. So the Americans heard only whispers of a handsome alcoholic bean-stealing robot and a bumbling bean-obsessed Frenchman. From these whispers, the Americans assumed, wrongly again, that the British had failed in creating a superior bean retriever 2.0, and again they were woefully unprepared when a rogue and unstable Michael attacked America of his own robot accord. This period in American history is known as the Michael Plague. Americans of this generation went to bed afraid of Michael's wrath, to hear their door crashing down in the middle of the night, and the screams of their children as every bean was ripped from their stomachs. Still, even by today's standards, Michael is considered one of the most deadliest weapons of war in history. The thing is, Michael was not designed with combative capabilities. As was stated, Michael's purpose was more to intimidate the Americans with his bean-filled head. So it's not like Michael was armed with lots of gadgets and gizmos that would make him such an ultimate weapon. He struck with metal fists and tore flesh with his bare hands that were designed only for menacing gestures and rude hand symbols, but never designed to make contact with another human, only beans. What happened here is that Michael's motherboard was corrupted and driven insane by his lack of purpose. You see, Michael was pampered and praised from the time he was just a little battery, and by the time he grew into a robot ready to be revealed to the public, his ego was so massive that he basically had a Christ complex, and although baked into his motherboard was a sweet, friendly persona, that sweetness was dwarfed by the chaos thrust into Michael's mind after losing his one true purpose. Put yourself in Michael's shoes. We all, for the most part, live average, unremarkable lives, hidden from the public eye. The upside here is the freedom that this unremarkability gives us to stay free from the chains of ego and expectation. Michael the robot was trained and designed to be a famous James Bond type that was beloved by the public but feared by the enemies of England. He was supposed to be a mix between like Tom Cruise and Ed Gein, where the public knows he's got some weird baggage, but he's still charming enough, and you never pick a fight with him because he might rip your face off and wear it like a mask. Though Tom Cruise and Ed Gein are American, so I guess a better comparison for British people would be like a combination of David Beckham and Mr. Blobby. Of course, this all seemed great on paper, and at first we know Michael was beloved by the public. But what happens when that was taken away by a chubby little Frenchman? See, Michael was never given the chance to live a life of peace, because an ever-unfillable destiny was baked into his very soul. Or rather, the little bundle of wires and flashing LED lights enclosed beneath his bean-filled dome. This unfillable destiny, once ripped away from Michael the bean-stealing robot, needed to be filled with something, and what better to fill it with than the one thing Michael was designed around controlling? Beans. So Michael terrorized the American people for months, and the British got word once limbs and heads floated across the pond, placed on top of which was always a single bean, Michael's calling card. The British were terrified of what they had created and ashamed of how it got so out of control, but there was no way to get this message over to the Americans, who thought the British were trying to destroy the country once and for all. It's reported that one day Benoit was walking the shores of his estate in England when he came upon the washed-up limb of an American, placed on top of which was a single bean, now recognized widely as Michael's omen of death. Benoit had been collecting beans to send across the pond in support of Michael defense fighters, but he was limited in his ability to act because of his commitment to his family, Beanie Bernstein and their newborn baby. Benoit was committed to the cause, but not as committed as he was to his family. But a wife and son were not the only family Benoit had, and as Benoit held the washed-up limb, his eyes stared open at the familiar white ruffled cuffs capping a velvet red coat sleeve, though it did not connect to its familiar torso, but ended with a bloody stump of an arm that once sat around Benoit's shoulders in comfort many a cold hard circus night. After the shock went away, Benoit cried, for the loss of his friend and the closest thing to a father he ever knew. Benoit couldn't help but wonder where lay the rest of the freak master's limbs and torso. Would a familiar face soon wash up, lids worm-bitten, eyes wide as Benoit's? Benoit's wife saw the pain on her husband's face. Beanie Bernstein, at that point known as Beanie Jeffany, understood that Benoit could not stand idly by. They lived a mostly private and solitary life together, farming beans, but Beanwa saw how Beanwa kept in touch with the circus whenever they came back through, and he would always share a cup of bean tea with his old friend the Freak Master as they sat among the beans farmland that Beanwa owned. The last time the circus came through was quite a while back. They told Beanwa that they were starting a new tour in America, and despite Beanwa's warning about safety concerns, the circus couldn't afford not to take the opportunity. Beanie encouraged her husband to get back out there and do what he felt was right. Chapter 5. The Trials of Beanwa Jeffany. Beanwa was a man of art and science, though his focus in science was very specific. He knew beans and he knew them well, but in other areas of life, Beanwa could be very ignorant. In fact, soon after Beanwa left the circus, his circus family found out that the financial records Beanwa had been keeping for the last 15 years were nothing but jumbles of random numbers listed in meaningless patterns. But what Beanwa did know was beans, and alongside his constant writing of bean poetry, he was also secretly developing countless bean varieties and accessories for the bean. Some of his most notable bean breakthroughs include the bean peeler, magnetic beans, beans for breakfast, bean-based medicine, including bean vaccines, surgery on a bean skin grafting, bean transfusions, and a hospital shaped like a bean, with hospital beds shaped like beans. But lots of fun things too, like the Bean roller coaster, Beanie Babies, Bean collectibles, Bean TV show, entire Bean streaming service with a Bean cinematic universe, Bean action figures, Bean and Friends morning talk show, Bean Senator, and the fish tank with beans that swim around in bean juice. That was how Beanwa made his fortune, but clearly his expertise in one area meant shortcomings in another area. Beanwa sometimes overestimated his ability and knowledge, and his shortcomings proved to be the greatest setback in Beanwa's ocean voyage to America. First of all, Beanwa had no knowledge of navigation on land or sea. He simply knew he needed a boat to get across the ocean to see if any of his circus family survived Michael's attacks to rescue them. So Beanwa decided to sell half of the bean farmland he owned to raise money to buy a boat big enough to fill it with all of England's top bean activists. Soon the majestic SS Bean sat in the coast ready for adventure. An ocean voyage was no place for a baby, so Beanwa's little wife Beanie had to stay in England, which is speculated to have become a point of resentment in their marriage. But Beanwa had his boat, and they say, build a boat and the bugmen will come. Old English slang referring to the boat's crew, who were always looking for work. But Beanwa did not mingle with the rough-and-tumble sea folk, but rather with the dancers and dreamers of England, the freaks and monstrosities who were cast out to the far reaches of England's bean fields. This community was as strong as a family, yes, but take Beanwa's shortcomings and multiply it by 15, and you have 15 well-meaning people who have no knowledge on boating or navigation. Most of them hardly knew how to swim. But Beanwa overestimated the power of his bean dreams. He felt that his love for beans always shined a light that directed him towards his goal. But the ocean proved to be a foreign and direction-skewing environment. The sea voyage began quite well, and the crew was in great spirits, dancing and singing and dreaming of the beans they would see. They saw no obstacle in sight. The still blue water welcomed them out to their adventure as the coast of England grew more distant. But the moment that coast was out of sight, however, it is said that things soured. The crew began to grow unsteady and lose their bearings with nothing but water in every direction. They sailed according to the sun, but soon arguments broke out whether the ship had turned around in the night, and they forgot the way where the sun was supposed to be leading them. Beanwa describes in his captain's log how once the panic began, he locked himself in the small captain's quarters of the SS Bean, tucked at the bottom of the ship. Beanwa writes that he heard screams and yelling, which soon turned into silence and whispers aboard the boat deck. With a crash and a bang, the entire boat rocked to a side and Beanwa was thrown to the other side of the ship. Beanwa knew, even with his limited knowledge of the world, that the only thing that could apply that much force to a boat was another boat, shooting cannonballs. He looked through the small periscope that extended all the way up to the ship's deck. He twirled it around 360 degrees, yet saw no ships to speak of. I will read a passage plucked straight from his journal. Madness, Madness, chaos, trapped in my cowardly box at the bottom of the boat, filled with the best bean colleagues and friends I could find. Yet I sit here, locked in a box. I thought boats would be easy. Basically, they just sit in the water and you move it around a bit if you get off course. But it turns out that my voyage has proven 100 times more difficult than I could have ever expected. My bean expertise didn't transfer to ocean voyages. I feel the ship filling with water. I hear the screams of my bean companions. Another blow sends me to the side of the ship. I peek through my periscope and see nothing but sea. This is where Beanoir's captain log ends, and Beanoir presumably stuffed his log into a glass bottle and threw it into the sea. Beanoir writes from this point on, describing the wreckage he awoke to, laying on his back atop a slab of broken SS Bean. This next period of Beanoir's journey is surprisingly the most well documented, because his writings and poems are done scratched onto the bones of Michael's discarded American victims, as well as bones from seabirds and fish that came too close to Beanoir's raft. His fishbone poems are more of haikus with how small the space he had to write was, and most of the writing was about beans. But he also described the dire circumstances he was in, stranded in the ocean. Beanoir describes how he survived eating each single bean which was placed atop Michael's victims' lifeless bodies. But soon the beans were not enough, and Beanoir took his first bite of human flesh. This is one of the most debated aspects and time periods of Beanoir's life. It is true that most of his surviving writings and his most well-preserved poems are from this era, but it is speculated that some degree of delirium and ocean hallucinations may have affected Beanoir's ability to accurately portray what he was experiencing. Whether or not Beanoir's writings delve into the realm of fantastical or nonsense, it is our job to relay his stories as they were written. They say the ocean is the last frontier, and we have only discovered about 2% of what is truly under those murky depths. Beanoir describes how his anger towards Michael and the Bean Wars grew with each bite of flesh he was forced to devour. Here is an excerpt from Beanoir's writing aboard the raft. "Flesh and blood sustain me. Flesh and blood are what keep me afloat. Michael, the dark purveyor of this flesh and blood, is all that I hate, but hate means nothing to the depths. The depths beckon on, fearful at first, but they soon show themselves as a blanket. The warmth of that blanket is how it hides what is below, that which we cannot comprehend and would not wish to, given the choice. Children dream of the slime, the darkness that hides Leviathan, but we are all children to an eye that dwarfs the sun, brighter and angrier but with no beans, mocked by its twin, blistered where not shivered, mocked by a common seabird, though not so common on close inspect. Did it fly here from 2 beans henceforth, a time beyond now, with birds of bright breast to reflect the blue depths? The uncommon seabird flies lower, mocking my stasis. The metallic shine scatters on the sea surface with each flutter of the seabird's white wing. The bird speaks in voice of dissonant tone, and pretends to offer help, though no movement I see in its beak. If only I had a bean to lure this demon bird, surely of Michael's creation, I would snatch its wing and sneak my teeth into its head, but tasting only the beans of Michael's dome. But a swipe too late and the future bird is gone, and in my despair I imagine a small organic hand waving, as if separate from the bird." End of excerpt. Clearly at this point, Beanoir had become delirious from lack of fresh water and probably some psychological damage from eating so much human flesh. Towards the end, it seemed he was imagining robotic seagulls, thinking they were the work of Michael the British Robot. To this day, it is believed that Michael the British Robot was the last robot Britain ever made, so it's highly speculated that Beanoir was going through a bout of bean fever. Bean fever is a scarcely known but highly deadly disease specific to those whose diet consists of a high bean content. However, it is not the overindulgence of beans that causes bean fever, but actually the withdrawal from beans after a heavy bean diet that can cause hallucinations and delirium. However, through this delirium, it seems that Beanoir was able to find his way finally to the coast of America. Beanwa describes in his bean bone carvings that the evil metallic seabird he saw surely as a product of Michael the British robot. He saw that the bird was heading back to England to tell the Queen about Michael's success. Beanwa, assuming that the seagull was heading towards England, simply paddled his raft in the opposite direction and successfully ended up in America. Beanwa's success in crossing the ocean by using a strange metallic bird for navigation is part of why people debate how delirious Beanwa really was. Either way, Beanwa was found by crabbers off the coast of New England, which he initially thought meant he had turned all the way around and ended up in a different part of England that he didn't know about, called New England. But after some confusion and sitcom-level hijinks where Beanwa was trying to swim back to England, which he thought was America, it was finally drilled into Beanwa's head that he really did make it to America. Chapter 6. The Land of the Bean. It turns out not all Americans were as quick to receive Beanwa with open arms as the immigrant crab workers who accidentally scooped him up from his sea raft into their crab net. To most Americans, and this applies to back then and even today, but to most Americans, a Frenchman to an Englishman is like a tomato to a tomato. It's the same thing, just by a different name. Modern-day American ignorance is based mostly on a lack of education, which is continuously cut from state budgets. You can't really blame them for it. And back then, American ignorance towards different Europeans was largely based on the terror that England was waging across the American countryside with Michael the British bean-stealing robot. You see, when you look at the issue from this angle, it gives a slightly more understandable reason for American ignorance. Imagine your entire country was being attacked by a bloodthirsty monster in the late 1800s, and the only thing you know about the monster is that it talks in a funny accent. How are you going to react when a weird man with a funny accent washes up on the beach and tells you to trust him while his pockets rattle with human bones that he carved creepy, weird things into? You're going to slam the door in his face and call the police to come beat him up and throw him in jail, and that's exactly what happened. But jail proved to be a fertile ground filled with soil, a new healthy environment in which Beanwa could plant new beans. As Beanwa recovered from his beatings, he never felt sorry for himself. He writes that every fist his face received was payback for his ignorance and cowardice that killed all of his bean friends on their ocean voyage. Beanwa got to know his jailmates and came to understand the culture around 1800s East Coast America and the problems these people faced that went far beyond a killer robot with a head filled with beans. The local crabbers were being shaken down by a mobster who promised to protect the neighborhoods from Michael in exchange for daily crabs. While in jail, Beanwa learned everything he could about the local gang to find a way to get them off the crabbers' backs and maybe find a way in with the American people. Beanwa made friends with the crabbers in jail and got their crab friends on the outside to pay his bail and get him released. He was broke, penniless, his brain foggy from his prolonged beating, but he needed money to travel in search of his circus family. Luckily, the local crab family trusted him and got him a job fishing for crabs. One day, while they were pulling in their crab load for the day, the mobster Beanwa had been hearing about finally showed up to shake some crabs down. Beanwa quickly rose to the top of the crab ladder and was head of the crew that day, so the mobster came up to him. The mobster said, "You don't look like the usual immigrant picking crabs from the sea. You looks to me like a high-city British type. The only reason them Europeans come here is to steal our beans and dismember our families. Let's see that bean-filled dome you got hiding under that obviously fake latex skin cap." The mobster had more thugs than Beanwa had crew members, and they held his crab compatriots at bay, while the thugs held Beanwa down to rip off his fake skin dome cover, to reveal the robotic bean-filled dome hidden below. Of course, Beanwa was not a robot, but a flesh and blood-filled man, whose heart pumped for the love of beans and the righteousness of man. So righteous was Beanwa's heart that even after getting scalped by the mobsters, he didn't give up on the Americans or his search for his remaining circus family. Beanwa became a legend for the way he stoically sat without expression while the mobster cut the skin off the top of his head. Again, Beanwa writes in his journals that this pain was nothing compared to the horror he subjected his poor bean friends to out on the ocean. The mobster himself, who held the bloody scalping knife, could not help but be impressed by the way Beanois held his own, and continued to refuse to give up any crabs, even with the blood running down his face and the cold breeze upon his newly bald head, which was bald of both skin and hair, yet clearly devoid of a single bean or robotic component. The mobster tried to recruit Beanois into his gang, seeing the value of having such a terrifying presence as part of the gang, but Beanois refused to help the gang with anything crime-related. He did offer them something else, though. Not a single crab, but a single bean, with which he would share with them the knowledge of how to grow an entire field of beans to feed their gang. At first the gang members laughed, but Beanois happened to have a pot of his homemade bean stew aboard the crab boat and offered each gang member a bowl. He made sure the mob boss was given a scoop with a large variety of beans, spices, and delicious broth. Shortly after, Beanois was teaching each gang member how to tend their own bean plot, and this new area of New England soon flourished with so many beans that there was no need for a conflict between the crabbers and mobsters, who were soon thereafter known not as mobsters, but as bean mongers. But as soon became a lasting phrase in American folklore, with beans comes Michael. Unlike the ocean bone carved bean scrolls, which may have been cryptic but at least gave some account directly from Beanois' own hand, Beanois, for the first time in many years, had a period where he did not record his life in writing. It is said that he had a squire of sorts who attended to his needs as he helped build the resistance against Michael. They say his rage lasted for days when he found the head of the recently reformed mob boss on his doorstep, mouth agape, filled with beans. It was clear that Michael knew about the resistance forming in New England, with a growing number of kidnappings and bean plant thefts. It's speculated that Michael also knew about Beanois' involvement in the resistance and considered the Frenchman a rival. Beanois kept his identity hidden as long as he could, knowing that Michael might recognize him from their bean debates and see him as a prime target. So despite trying to stay low, Beanois' growing influence in America and his usual bean-themed tactics made him stand out and soon get recognized as the famous French bean politician. Beanois wasn't there to be a military leader. He was there to find his family, but he couldn't stop himself from helping those in need and spreading the good word of the bean. So he kept searching for his family with little success, at the same time as he tried to protect his friends in New England and grow a whole lot of beans. But as he stood holding the head of the mobster who scalped him, a man who he came to consider a friend, Beanois knew that sitting and planning would be the death of them all. He thought like a bean needs to grow and find its footing in the dirt before emerging to do its duty. Similarly, he must grow his American roots. But the bean roots were being ripped out from under him while he sat and planned. There are rumors that Beanois sought comfort in the company of a crabman's daughter, but as was stated previously, much of what we know of this time is based on the writings of Beanois' squire, who had poor grammar and handwriting, so it's difficult to understand what he meant. It could have been something about the crabman's laughter rather than sleeping with the crabman's daughter. But what we do know for sure, based on the large migration of New England people during this time, is that Beanois and his rebel uprising against Michael the bean-stealing robot had begun, their plans of revolt in motion. Chapter 7. Seizing the Beans of Production. To understand the bean wars of America in the late 1800s, you have to understand the ways American society was different back then. Americans of this time desperately needed something to hold on to, like the British with their beans. There was no president yet, there was no constitution, barely any laws, and day by day society was breaking down further as the people were ripped apart and the fields were plunged of beans by Michael the British robot. There is no religion yet, because that's partially what the Americans left England to escape from. Of course, the Americans would go on to create some of the wackiest and most absurd cockadoodle religions in history, but at this time they were still trying out the whole separation of church and state thing. So they had no savior figure to hold on to. So to have this strange yet enigmatic Frenchman, who at first seems like a rambling bean-obsessed lunatic, washed up on the New England shores, but then prove himself to be the most well-spoken and civic-minded person the Americans had ever met, was basically like seeing a holy figure for some Americans. Beanois challenged everything the Americans knew about Europe and other countries to the east. Many New Englanders even began to learn the difference between France and England, out of respect for Beanois and his fight against Michael the British bean-stealing, flesh-tearing robot. So at first Beanois' growth in America seemed impossibly slow, but over time he grew the trust of the smelly crabmen, then the enemies of the crabmen, and he focused the entire region onto one singular enemy, the enemy of all men and beans, Michael. America can be a very monkey see, monkey do kind of place. It's sort of like, I don't want to miss out, so when they see a bunch of people doing something, even if it looks useless or bad, they still have to try it out. This is how so many unremarkable things have gotten so big in the world and grown into massive institutions like the Nazis and Twitch streaming. But sometimes that blind following, when that power is put behind a man with a righteous goal, he can become more than a man, which is what was needed for a movement like what Beanois and the New Englanders were planning. There was a lot of moving and hiding around of the New England rebel troops at this time. With the nature of the secrecy of their goal and the threat of what would happen if Michael found them, it seems Beanois avoided writing anything at all, and he even stopped conveying his inner thoughts to his half-literate squire, fearing a possible kidnapping and torturing for info. It is said that Beanois grew more isolated and less expressive due to his inability to simply sit out in a bean field and write about beans. There is one poem written by Beanois during this time before the Bean War's end, which was technically written by his squire, but this poem is speculated to have been carefully dictated by Beanois himself. It goes as follows. The soil is dry, but I'm still here, a bean that forgot to grow. Or did I grow, but far beyond what my soil system could support? Cut from its roots, a bean is a nut, hardened, thirsting, a stiff nut stunted by the duty he begrudgingly bears. 12 freak heads in a row outside our camp border. The New Englanders joke about the appearances, laughing at the bearded woman, my bearded woman. But I said nothing, and I will say nothing, nay, until the cursed bean demon of England is put to sleep. This is considered the last poem that Beanois ever wrote. It is unknown if he lost his passion or just wrote everything that needed to come out. Perhaps the bean is not as deep as he thought, and he reached the center, dissected every inch of its flesh and skin. 1,000 bean devices and accessories to maximize the bean's potential. Did he do everything with the bean that could be done, or was his bean spark cut short by the endless tragedies he was forced to face? There were many battles and skirmishes that occurred towards the end of the American Bean Wars, and entire books could be written about the strategic offense and strategies that both sides used. That is more kind of nerd stuff, and this book is more about the emotional tragedy of the bean. So yes, there were many battles, but I will not delve into the blood and needless death, which was all that those battles gave us. Battle gives us little in the way of poetry or bean science breakthroughs, but sometimes war is necessary. A notable bean battle worth mentioning was the Bean Battle of Beanworth Hill, where one victory tale is told. Counts say there was an epic battle on a hilltop clearing in a forest. They say in this forest clearing atop the rising hill, Michael and Beanois fought in hand-to-hand combat, with Beanois using pre-planned defenses to counter the robotic power. Beanois was never known for his skill as a fighter, but it's possible he trained over the harsh year with the American Bean Rebels. They say Beanois came armored with cushioned arm pads and a reflective padded helmet to absorb Michael's robotic blows and shine the light into his eyes, but the defensive gear only lasted so long and Michael tore them off. But Beanois had more tricks up his circus-trained sleeves, and from those sleeves extended a tube to squirt grease across Michael's bean dome, the other hand a lighter to ignite the grease stream and set fire across Michael's bean dome. But Michael only laughed because he felt no pain. But Beanois saw the bubbling bean boil begin to rise in Michael's head, though Michael seemed unaware. Beanois, naked of protective padding, pivoted in time just to miss the blow Michael directed at his heart, but the metal fist cracked through Beanois' shoulder and rendered his arm useless. At this moment, Beanois' rebel bean men made it to the hilltop to assist him, but Beanois knew this was a one-on-one bean duel, and he tried raising his arm to stop them, but he realized it no longer responded to his brain's command. So he used his other arm. As Beanwah lay on the ground from his shoulder blow and waved off his soldiers, the beans in Michael's head had reached a boiling point, melting down through the brain robotics below. Michael fell like a plank towards Beanwah and pinning Beanwah's shattered shoulder to the ground. But Beanwah won. This story could be fake just as likely as it could be the cold hard bean truth. It's hard to say because most of the people there died shortly after from the bean fever. The series of bean battles that lasted over a year ended with the widely reported news of Michael's death. There was no body and his final whereabouts were unknown. Others say that Beanwah tried to reason with Michael in their ultimate showdown, but Michael was too enraged to listen to the man he saw as a rival. They say Michael swung down a robotic fist at the same time as 500 smelly crabmen shot their slingshots filled with rocks in Michael's glass bean-filled dome. Some witnesses say they saw Beanwah slurping beans from the cracked dome of Michael's robot head as he sat atop the hill watching the sunset. Regardless of how it really happened, Beanwah had effectively ended the Bean Wars once word spread about Michael's destruction. But this was no conclusion to the political conflict over that small object that started it all. In some ways, post-Michael, the bean conflict only grew more intense. England officially apologized for Michael the robot's behavior, and they vowed to never again create robotics beyond that of a toaster, and they sent all the remaining smart robot-making British people over to Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. But England really only made these grand gestures of apology because they still wanted sole ownership of the bean. At this point, many Americans didn't care for any apology. They felt they were owed the sole ownership of the bean. Bean conflict grew again with no end in sight, and that tired Beanwah, who was about to sail home to England to see his wife, instead sailed to a neutral island zone in the ocean between England and America, calling for both countries to meet at a large summit of great officials, citizens, and fishmongers from the coasts of both countries. At this time, Beanwah was recognized across the world as not just a bean-loving French lunatic, but a leader equivalent to Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi. So the countries agreed, and hundreds of politicians, citizens, and fishmongers accepted Beanwah's invitation, and they all came to listen. Beanwah stood at a podium, his feet atop a wooden plank suspended by 4 bean cans to lift him high enough to be seen behind the podium. The crowd whispered in excitement as he adjusted the microphone to give his powerful and famous speech, widely known as 2 Beans Henceforth, also called the Bean Address. I will recite the speech now in its entirety to give context for how impactful this moment was. Close your eyes and imagine you're there in the crowd now as Beanwah spoke in front of thousands of fishmongers, citizens, politicians, and the wounded. I come here today to speak of peace, and beans, of course. 2 beans henceforth, a day will come. When that day comes for sure is uncertain, because we don't know how beans translate to our current way of measuring time. But we know that day will come, and on that day there is a choice, and within that choice is a bean, a small bean that we are all choosing to overlook. My brothers and sisters, you ask of me, what is that bean? And I tell you, that bean is a seed. Sure, a tasty treat, but left uneaten, a bean can grow far beyond its means. There's a story of a boy in a beanstalk. As a child in fire-torn England, traveling the stony shores, my circus folk told me of this tale, but I fought and I screamed each time they spoke of it. I shouted, you show me the bean in your tale. 1,000,000 beanstalks across the countryside, but none so grand as your paltry, pathetic bean story. I was a bitter child, but I knew even then that a bean should not be exaggerated or ignored, but seen simply as it is. So I present to the nations here today a simple bean. I will plant this bean here where I stand, and the direction of the first bean that sprouts, wherever it points, is the country that the bean has chosen. That country will control all beans for 1,000,000,000 beans henceforth. I say to you, my tired and bean-hungry people, will you let the bean decide? Does everyone? His speech was cut short as Beanwah was shot dead on the spot. Assassinated in a moment that shook the world, but was cut out of the history books of the 2 nations responsible for that conflict that ended an innocent bean man's life. Neither England or America was ever held directly responsible for the assassination. The shooter was actually reported to be Benoit's own wife, Beanie Bernstein, angry at her husband's infidelity across the pond. Yes, Benoit did many great things, but history is not so clean as we may wish. No man is perfect, and the true motives of Beanie are unknown, as she was reported dead shortly after her husband. But in the shock of Benoit's death, both countries agreed to Benoit's bean-based proposal of peace, and a month later the first bean sprouted. But it sprouted upwards. Chapter 8. The Trick. Benoit knew beans, and by studying beans for years, he knew that the first bean to sprout on a beanstalk always points upwards. The Americans and British were enraged, but they had agreed to a binding contract. In the end, it was decided that no one nation could truly own the bean, and the bean was freed. From then on, every person in the world could grow all the beans they wanted. That's where the story ends, but not for me. If you remember, my real name is Bugman Jeffany, the descendant of Benoit Jeffany, and heir to his scrolls and poetic bean works. What I am about to say is placed deep enough in the book that hopefully only the truly devoted bean people will listen this far. I want revenge for the murder of Benoit Jeffany. I don't think his wife did it. By all accounts, they were happy, and there are photos of her sobbing at his funeral. It just doesn't add up. And the one thing that never gets mentioned again in the history books? Michael the British bean-stealing, flesh-tearing robot. Do you really think the British just never tried making a Michael 2.0? I bet a great deal that they created many Michaels, Steves, and Johns. John the British robot is not something I want to cross paths with, but he is probably out there. What about Stephanie, the British robot, and she tries to seduce you with her funny British voice and her robotically sculpted body, and then she rips the beans from your throat right after sensually spoon-feeding them to you? I'm not saying that half the British population might be secret bean-domed robots, but let's just say that the fake skin latex bean dome covers have advanced a lot since the late 1800s. Half of all British people could be bean robots, and it would be really hard to tell. They eat beans on toast. Beans on toast. Name a food that sounds more like it was designed by a bean robot. I don't think there is one. Beans, toast, both great staples on their own, but don't combine them and make it a central part of your culture. But maybe I'm just still trying to misplace the blame for my great-great-grandfather's assassination. I know things got a bit heavy there with all the bean politics, but that is the nature of beans. Blood and beans are intertwined throughout all of history, but aren't beans also supposed to be fun? Well, it gets more fun now. Now that beans were free for all people to use for whatever they wanted, the variety of beans flourished in the Beanaissance period. They made bean burritos and bicycles with bean wheels. It seems that we would call those days the Bronze Age of bean innovation, with the Gold and Silver Ages of bean innovation occurring during Benoit Jeffany's life. Though bean popularity always ebbs and flows, it seems that the great bean inventions are of a time long past. There are a few scientists around the world working on things like this, but it's hard to get funding for bean-based projects after all the destruction and blood that beans have caused. So what are my plans to expose Michael, the British bean-stealing robot, as the true killer of Benoit Jeffany? The first part of my plan was to dig up Beanie Bernstein's corpse and judge how much muscle mass she would have had based on her bones, and see if it would have even been possible for her to lift the gun that shot the type of bullet that killed Benoit. I already did this part of the plan. I dug out my great-great-grandmother, and there's just no way that her bone structure would have held the muscle mass required to lift that sniper rifle. It just doesn't add up. While I was having this revelation in the graveyard, the British authorities rode up on their horses and started yelling at me, and I ran away, but they got pictures of my face, and now I'm wanted in England for grave robbing. So much for clearing the family name. Now I've only stained it further. Well, the only way out is through. I knew I needed to find more evidence on Michael, and where better place than the place he was created? I don't have many friends, but I do know this one guy who works at the Queen's Palace. He wears one of those funny hats, and he let me borrow his dumb little suit, and I tried to sneak into the Queen's Palace. The guards caught me, and they knew I was an imposter, and they ripped off my dumb hat along with all of my clothes, so I was naked outside the palace. But as I was walking along outside, shamefully covering myself with a large palm leaf from one of the iconic trees outside the palace, I noticed a little rabbit hole on the side of the fence outside the view of the guards. I tried to dig my way under, but I got stuck, and as I kept trying to wriggle through, my legs and exposed buttocks flailing in the wind, I had a realization. Maybe I was going about this the wrong way. I scooted my way back out, and I walked up to one of the guards. I said, "Sorry, sir, I've been having a rough time of it, and could I just maybe come inside and grab some clothes?" They refused and asked me why I thought they would have clothes in there for me. I said, "Well, it seems like a pretty huge palace, probably a lot of rooms in there. At least one of them might be filled with clothes." "And we'd give them to you," they said sarcastically. "So there are clothes, and if you're not using them, why can't I have them?" "There isn't clothes," they said, and they started beating me, and I blacked out and I woke up in British jail. This was a new low for me because I had no leads and I was stuck in a jail cell surrounded by weird men who smelled like fish. Then it hit me. This is where I was supposed to be. Just like Beanois, I was placed in this cell like a bean placed in fertile soil, and it was my job to connect with the other beans to grow a network that would strengthen us all and help us reach the surface. Beans weak alone, but beans together strong. I mingled with the fishy-smelling men just like my great-great-grandfather before me. I drank of their toilet rum and I bandaged their wounds. It turned out that these were men of the oyster. They had a hard shell to pry open, but I pried it open, and I snuggled into the gooey center and made friends. Through my oyster friends, I heard of unrest among the bean fields in North Ireland. But there was no bean famine, no bean riots, no bean stock crashes. It all smelled of Michael to me. But I was no more of a fighter than my great-great-grandfather before me. But I needed to travel north, because I could hear the beans calling to me, crying out. As I traveled across the English countryside and through the iconic bean fields, I felt that this must be how Beanois felt as a young boy traveling with the circus. I was stopped by an old man who asked me to help pull his broken wagon filled with beans back to his bean shack. I agreed to help, and the old man gave me a smile and slipped a sack of beans into my shirt pocket. I walked inside with his large sacks filled with beans, and he told me he had beans and toast. What would I take? I said just beans would be fine. He seemed slightly offended, so I said a bit of toast would be fine, and he seemed to cheer up. I sat at the dinner table, and his daughter came down to eat with us. I had never seen a bean man's daughter, and I was stunned. Not by her beauty or body, but by the extent of her bean expertise. To grow up as a bean man's daughter, you grow up knowing the soil and beans from the time you can grab a fistful of beans. And boy, did she know her beans. I could have listened to her and her father argue about beans for hours, but I knew I had to keep going north and follow my only lead. As I strapped my bean portions to the saddle of the horse they lent me, the bean man's daughter ran out to catch me before I left. We embraced, and she passed a bean from her mouth to mine, an old English courting method. It was hot. I promised I would return, and I set off north over the border of Ireland and past the Irish Guard, who were a lot more chill and relaxed than the uptight British ones, and the outfits were way cooler too. It's like a flat-brimmed hat instead of the weird Marge Simpson hair, and it's just like a low-key stylish t-shirt and jeans with a little chain on the pocket. And they let me go through without trouble, but then when I tried to ask them about any bean news, they thought I was being racist, and they asked if I was going to start talking about potatoes next. I got out of there by the skin of my beans, but I didn't know where to go next. So I traveled to the very tip of Ireland through the thickest fields of beans that I never could have dreamed of. The bean farmer that owned these beans was not quite as nice as the southern bean men, and he chased me away from his crops, and I ran and hid to the far northeast corner of Ireland. That's when I saw it, right on that northeast corner of Ireland. It was a handsome sculpted body of a man with no head, bending down to pick beans and place them in a basket. I rode up to him on my horse and inspected the stump from where a head used to be. I called out his name, but Michael did not respond. Maybe he wasn't Michael any longer. He was no longer a threat, that was for certain. But I wasn't satisfied. I needed answers, though he had no mouth to give them. I grabbed his shoulders and I shook him around a bit, and I kicked over his basket of beans. He didn't react. He just bent over and started gathering the beans that I spilt back into his basket. I knocked it over again. This time I thought his torso looked at me for a second. Was there a bit of Michael brain still in there? But he bent back down to gather his beans. Right as he finished picking all of his beans back up, I kicked the basket over again. As night began to fall, I rode off south, with Michael's headless, hog-tied body strapped to the back of my horse. Chapter 9. The Bean Man's Folly. How dare you bring that demon technology onto my bean land? The old bean farmer yelled at me while his daughter cried in the corner. I should never have lent you that horse, or I should have given you the horse with the bad hoof that always falls over and kills the rider. No, Daddy, no, the bean man's daughter cried out, but he kept yelling. You plant your beans in my daughter and take my horse, only come back in here with a demon. I know that bean you planted deep in my daughter will grow up to be a demon just the same. I tried to explain to the old man that I never did anything with his daughter beyond the ritualistic passing of the bean from mouth to mouth. It was really quite tame as far as 21st century physical relations go, but he was having none of it, and he threw beans at my head, hardened beans, uncooked, and they pelted my head with the power of a handful of beans. I ran out of there, grabbing Michael's headless body as I ran. I didn't stop running until I was out of breath, and my shoulders ached with the weight of Michael. It's a shame how that played out. I really liked that bean girl. I could have seen us building something together, probably based on the cultivation and sale of beans and other legumes, but we could have been happy. I had a choice to stay with her before traveling north to find Michael, but I guess it wasn't good enough for me. I didn't want to settle down no matter how good it looked. I needed closure. I needed revenge. But is this where Beanois went wrong? He had a wife and a newborn son and many beautiful acres of bean farmland. But was he so intent on tying up every loose bean end and getting justice that it cost him his passion, love, and ultimately his life? Am I a bean trying to grow far beyond my means? It seems like Michael put his past behind him, though it hardly seems like his choice. He seems to exist now in a perpetual state of nerve reactions, like any decapitated animal. So I dropped Michael's headless corpse. With no way of communicating, it seemed like a dead end. He was dead weight that I needed to drop, same as the dead weight of uncertainty that plagues me and sent me on this journey of beans. I have a lot in common with Beanois, but a lot separates us. For one, we are blood relatives and share a passion for beans and bean history and bean culture, but I could never be the great bean leader he was. I used to be ashamed by this, but I realize now that Beanois sacrificed what he did in order for me to live my life and do with my beans what I wish. To wrap things up in a nice tight bean-filled tortilla, I want to encourage people to not underestimate the bean. Like Beanois shows us, you can do great things by focusing on a simple bean. But do not attach too much to the bean, or you run the risk of turning out like Michael the British robot. There is a healthy middle that we must strive to find, a middle ground unsteady only because the ground is covered with beans. Beans free for the taking, free for anyone to eat. Beans of all shapes and sizes, bean accessories and bean modifiers, bean-scented towels, bean parachute, coffee made out of beans but they're pinto beans, dripping bean green screen that you're watching right now, baked bean Twitch stream, bean e-girls, bean submarine that only operates in beans, bean ocean for the bean submarine, bean dolls for the girls, fill the dolls with beans to save money. The doll serves as a survival kit because you can rip it open for beans if your kid is hungry. Bean television filled with beans, call it the Bean-O-Vision. Bean daycare to leave your beans at, a font where every letter looks like a bean, a British bean robot. No, I take that one back. No more bean robots.